Sweden used to be a footballing great, reaching deep into the knockout stage in many early tournaments. Olympic gold in 1948, World Cup semi-final appearances, silver on home soil in 1958. Despite ceasing to be a major footballing power, Sweden remained a decent side with the occasional golden generation. We generally qualify for every other World Cup and have been a staple at the European Championship since 2000. But that trend is in real danger of ending. Swedish clubs have suffered similar declines. Nowadays it's inconceivable that Malmö FF would play in a Champions League final, or that IFK Göteborg would win 2 Europa League titles. Insufficient player development is a major problem in Swedish football. The emergence of good players like Alexander Isak and Dejan Kulusevski somewhat disguises the fact that Sweden has fallen behind in this domain. Comparisons with Denmark are never far away when discussing Sweden, and the truth is that our southern neighbors nowadays sell players for twice as much as we do. Even Norway has surpassed us. And this is only counting transfers from the domestic leagues, so Erling Haaland's move to City, among other things, aren't counted. One of the most negative consequences of this underwhelming player development is the lack of playing time it leads to. These numbers speak for themselves. Swedish players don't play enough to perform at a high level. In Europe's top 5 leagues last season, Danish footballers played 3 times as many minutes as Swedish players. And again, now even Norway beat us in this regard. For the first time in history, Sweden have the worst teams in Scandinavia when it comes to both international and club football. It's tragic. Svensk Elitfotboll, an organization that often works closely with the Swedish FA, did recently hire renowned football consultants Double Pass to improve football in the country. It's a step in the right direction, but too little too late. Things will most likely get worse for a few years before they start improving. Player development is not the only thing holding Sweden back. We also have a manager who has overstayed his welcome, which is a shame. For years, Jan Andersson got the most he could out of the Swedish squad, often surpassing demands. Few people predicted us to qualify for the 2018 World Cup from such a tough group. Even fewer people expected us to reach the quarterfinals. He also guided us to a respectable performance at Euro 2020, despite the devastating extra-time exit to Ukraine. This was followed by a great start to the World Cup qualifiers, but things turned south after the win against Spain. Losses to Greece, Georgia, and Spain ended Sweden's hopes of direct qualification, and ultimately saw us lose to Poland in the playoffs. Disappointing, but not catastrophic. The same can't be said about our subsequent Nations League display, which saw us suffer relegation to the C division, and by extension make it mathematically impossible for us to get a playoff spot in the Euro 2024 qualifiers. But no problem, all we gotta do is not finish behind the top 2 in our qualifying group, and we won't have to rely on any playoffs. Yeah, that's not looking too promising. In fact, we will probably miss consecutive major tournaments for the first time in over 25 years. Even if we by some miracle do qualify, Sweden shouldn't need a miracle to qualify for a 24-team Euro. Our current situation speaks volumes of how far we've fallen. It's clear Jan Andersson's tactics have become obsolete. Playing in a 4-4-2 isn't working for us anymore, and any time we try other formations, we look like headless chickens. He is also notorious for making substitutions too late in matches. However, given our poor player development and their lack of playing time, it's sadly unclear if a managerial change would even improve our situation. Regardless, it's a mandatory adjustment to make. You can't do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. Jan Andersson has gotten enough chances. It's clearly not working. Nevertheless, the Swedish FA still has full confidence in him. Yeah, we could lose to Estonia in September and he still wouldn't be fired. Here's another fun fact for you. No Swedish national team manager has ever been fired. Ever! This speaks volumes about the insufficient demands that plague Swedish football culture, as well as the inability to make tough but necessary decisions. One of many ways this manifests itself is by how scorelines and league tables aren't kept track of in children's football. And this has only been the case since 2017, so if this has negative consequences, we haven't even begun seeing them at a senior level yet. Additionally, the Swedish FA and their collaborators aren't aiming as high as they should. Svensk Elite Football currently allocates 1.3 million euros to Swedish academies. In Norway, that same number is around 8 million. Facility shortage is another issue. Adequate facilities are essential to enable year-round training, which is nowadays mandatory to keep up with top-level football. In Sweden, it's unfortunately impossible to head out and play in the middle of January. For ages 16 to 19, Swedish players actually practice more than a lot of other nations. The main problems lies in ages 8 to 12, where even countries like Iceland practice twice as much. Earlier, I made comparisons with Denmark and Norway. However, if we look at the big picture that spans decades, you could make the case that we'd be underperforming even if we were on par with our neighbors. Look at Portugal, whose footballers played 5 times as many minutes as Swedes last season. Sweden's population is almost identical. Portugal has much better weather for developing football players, to be fair, but Sweden should be able to make up for that with our more than twice as high GDP. Not to mention we became a major force in the game much earlier, which is an inherent advantage. The big question isn't why we have fallen behind other Scandinavian countries. It's why aren't we as good as Portugal? Why are we a team that's happy to merely reach the knockout stages of major tournaments, when we arguably should be a footballing powerhouse, challenging for titles? Now on to a more controversial point, albeit one definitely worthy of discussion. Artificial grass. Artificial grass is very common in Swedish football. The ball tends to roll faster and less predictably. Football at a high level in other leagues is generally played on non-artificial surfaces, so it can be difficult for Swedish players to become accustomed to natural turfs in the top leagues when they're used to artificial grass domestically. This is hardly the biggest problem, but definitely worthy of discussion and mentioning. There are a lot of problems facing Swedish football. We should be so much better. No one would be happier than me if this video aged like milk and Sweden won the rest of our qualifying games. But we won't.